Hey guys, welcome back to the Workbench. Dan here, and I'm here for another weathering video on a AEX covered hopper. This is another Intermountain prototype. These are great models, as I said before. They offer a lot of different paint schemes and opportunities for patch variants and cool weathering jobs. And I'm working on a bunch of these 4750s right now. I got basically a whole box full of these that I'm just going through and selecting at a time. And I'm only filming the really good ones that I want to weather for these video series, just to give you guys some inspiration and ideas on how to weather some of these covered hoppers. Just some different variations in weathering types and stuff like that. So the next one is going to be this car here. I really love these. I'm not going to try to pronounce that because I can't speak French very well. Yeah. So anyway, I'm going to try to weather this one out based on some prototype photos of another car that I found that's owned by CC. I'm not sure who actually is CC, the reporting mark anyway. But again, they're pretty accurate right out of the box. All I'm going to do to this one is fade it down really well, scrape up the lettering, and then do some other stuff and things like that. So this is the base model to give you guys an idea. And then this is the prototype car that I'm going to be weathering. And I'm going to be making this one into a AEX covered hopper. So you can see there's a lot of bright rust on the top, some grain spillage, the hatches are all mismatched and replaced, a lot of streaking on the side, there's some cool patching, and then a lot of grime and heavy streaks and washes on the underbody. New safety stripes added, some patching like I said, and then a lot of grime and stuff on the end. So I'm going to be trying to replicate that. The only difference is I'm going to be making this particular car a AEX patched car. So that's the only difference. So let's go ahead and get into this weathering project. So before I actually weather this model, I've had to make a few modifications to the car body and the top, and I'm going to add some little sills to the top as well. First thing I did was I removed the roof walks. Like the last hopper, I decided to just take these off for the weathering process, since I'm going to be doing a lot of rust up there. I don't want these to get necessarily too dirty. Also, I'm thinking about swapping some hatches around to add some variation and variety to this car, because like I said, these hatches get replaced all the time. So, and anyway, on the bottom, I modified the bay hatches a little bit because these are the short style hatches, the small discharge gates, so I just modified these with a pair of nippers and a little bit of filing to smooth them out. That's a very basic modification, but that's a common one you see on these cars. These hatches usually can be either the short variants or the long variants, so I modified those on this car to match the prototype. Now the other thing is I decided to add some channeling. Okay, so we're ready to go ahead and start the weathering process, but before we can get into it fully, I had to make a couple modifications to the car body. The first thing was I removed the hatches from the top just for the ease of weathering. I'm also going to modify the hatches on these by swapping them out or repainting some to make them look like they were replaced. It's a common thing on these covered hoppers, they get swapped out all the time. On the bottom, I modified the discharge gates, and I cut them down and shortened them and then sanded them so that they are the shortened version of the gates. This is a common thing that you see on these 4750s and other covered hoppers. Some of them will have the long gates, some with the short. In this case, this prototype has short gates, so I modeled my car as such. Now, the other thing that you'll see on these 4750s a lot, and it's something that Intermountain really didn't model on a lot of these cars, other than a few that they modeled kind of in the later runs, was adding the channeling to the top portion of these cars. And what I'm going to do to modify this model and add them is I'm going to be using some styrene material here. So I've cut this one out to size, and basically what you're going to do is you're going to glue a section like this to the top portion of these ribs like this, and that's going to serve as channeling. And I'm going to glue that in place. I'm going to paint match this, and then the next thing that we're going to do is paint match this by hand, just paint match that, and then I'll start weathering up the lettering a little bit, scuffing that up, and then we can actually start the weathering process. So let me glue these on and paint them, and then we'll come back. You can see I've added that little bit of channeling on top. That's in place and it looks really good. It's all custom painted in place and it's not going anywhere, so that's good. Now we got to start working on this lettering before we can actually start fading the main portion of the car. On the prototype, it's pretty well chipped up and faded in, and we're going to enhance this with some whitewash fading in a second, but I want to further enhance this beforehand. I want to actually model the lettering how it's all chipped up. So what I like to do is I just take a sharp X-Acto blade and I'll just go in there and scuff up the edges and rough these letters up a little bit. Just make them look kind of beat up and old, and you just go in and you just really are gliding the knife on the surface of the car. I'm not trying to damage the underlying paint. I'm just trying to scrape these graphics, and it's pretty easy with these graphics because it's raised ink printing, so it'll catch the blade before the blade goes into the paint, so it'll just sort of slowly scrape at it. I don't want to completely remove the lettering here. I'm just doing some very minor subtle scraping effects. Okay, so it's pretty simple, it's pretty self-explanatory. You just go in and just carefully work at it. Some letters I'll skip over a little bit, some letters I'll just lightly go over, others I'll go pretty heavy over. It just depends what it looks like on the prototype. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to brush in some acrylic, a little bit of white and a little bit of gray mixed together. It's basically the same color I used for that top railing that I added, and I'm just going to do a couple letters at a time like this, and I'm just sloppily working that paint over the lettering like this. Alright, so you get that first, and then I like to come back in with a Q-tip and I'll just sort of blotch it, just like that. Just kind of work that paint out a little bit, and it creates this blotchy looking effect where the lettering looks like it's starting to ghost and peel, and that's what I want. So I'm just going to repeat that process for all of these letters up here. If we look at the car now, I got it faded down, so you can see on the sides there's a dramatic change in color. The whole thing's pretty evenly faded out. You can see all that. The lettering looks pretty good too. I'm pretty happy with that. Just looking over it, comparing to some prototype photos. I'm using some other photos right now to kind of compare the fade, and I think we're pretty good on it. So I'm going to go ahead and call it there. Anyway, we're ready to go ahead and move on to the grime coat, and it's going to mostly be on the bottom of the car. I'm going to not do it too much to the sides, really. I might shoot the top around these hatches a little bit and the roof walk, but I'm not going to try to do the sides if I can, because I want to try to do all brush effects on that. And I'll probably try to spray a little bit on these end cages because it's obviously pretty hard to get in there with the brushes to paint stuff. So I'm going to be using my Grime mix, and it's going to be a mixture of black, mostly black and a little bit of earth brown mixed with a little bit of rubbing alcohol. And I'm running my air gun at 40 psi to do all this, so I'll demonstrate just a little clip of what I'm trying to do. I'm going to go in and I'm just going to get my brush kind of close here, and I'm just tucking this grime into these little corners like this. I'm just going to slowly build up these coats of grime. I'm not going to try to overdo it. If there's an area that might be a little too dark, I'll just go in and I'll clean it up a little bit. But I'm just trying to go in and just gently coat these little areas up, get some color detail, darken everything up here. So it's pretty straightforward. But I'm just going to basically go in and I'm just going to hit all of these areas on the underbody up at all these different angles, because it can make it a little bit of a challenge with these bays because they're at very specific angles. So you just basically move the car around and then just hit everything up to fill in all those little seams. So I'm just going to work on that for the most part for the next little while. So with the grime coat on and dull coated in place, I'm going to go ahead and start patching out this lettering. And I'm going to be doing an AEX car, so I'm going to be doing the main patching on the exNAHX to represent some older patching, and then I'm going to probably do something different for these numbers. I think I've got an idea how to do that, but I want to replicate this by using a little bit of earth brown and a little bit of charcoal gray acrylic, and I just thin it down a lot with water, and I'll usually apply it kind of roughly because a lot of these older patches aren't perfect. I just like to very slowly brush it in with a fine tip brush, and I will just slowly build up the coats to what I need. Sometimes on these cars they won't even patch them very well, or the patching will be so old that the old lettering will be bleeding through, so that's something you can kind of consider doing. But that's a great thing with doing your patches by hand, is that you have the freedom to be able to kind of do them and manipulate them however you want. But I'm going to try to cover these numbers and letters up pretty well on this particular car to match the prototype. So I'm just going to do my rough outline, and then I'm just going to, like I said, slowly go in and I'll just fill all this in. So I got most of the patching done on the side of this car for the reporting mark area, and this is also the same on the ends too. And I'm going to go ahead and just patch out these numbers with some black trim film decals. I decided to just keep it simple, and then my plan is I'll just put the AEX decals, the patching over that. So I'm going to be using the microscale trim film. This is it right here. This is a great product if you want to be able to do your own patching. All you got to do is take a straight edge, you cut out little strips that you need, and then you soak them in water like any other regular decal, adjust them and set them in place, and then you can do all kinds of cool patching and stuff like that. It's a really great way to, you know, model all these really cool effects doing the patching like that. So I'm going to go ahead and cut a couple strips out, which I already have soaking in my water bowl, and I will apply these to the numbers. Well, I'm not even going to bother removing them. You won't even need to. You're just going to decal right over them. So the main part of the patching is done on the car, and I'm going to weather over all of this before I put the AEX patches on because I want them to look relatively new. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start weathering the underbody, and just like the other AEX car I showed before, I like to use oils to enhance my weathering underneath, and I'll go in and add some rust spots and stuff to this later on, and I'll show you guys how to do that. But the first thing to do here is do all the base weathering, and this is what we're really focusing on here, is the base weathering. Stuff like the rust spots, the fine scratching, and everything like that can wait. This is all the color build-up stages here that we need to do to get everything where it needs to be. And again, I like to preach about how much I love these Winsor & Newton oils. These were shown to me a long time ago, and someone explained how they use these, and I don't know why I waited so long to switch to oil paints for a lot of my work, because I mean, this stuff is amazing. I used to use all acrylic and powders to try to achieve rust effects, and I got somewhat good at it, but this is just a whole other level. I mean, you can do so much more with the Winsor & Newton oils, or any oil in general. Not just water mixable, but I do prefer the water mixable because they're easier to clean up and they're a little bit more forgiving compared to some other oils which also have a long drying time. So that's why I personally prefer the water mixable oils. This is burnt umber here. This is a common color. This is a very good color for dark rust, dark earth tones. You can of course get some other tones of oil and mix it together to get a darker tone if you need to, but in this case this will work fine for this prototype. So I'm going to also use some clean strip. This is the mineral spirits. So that's what I'm going to be using to dilute this down. Odorless thinner, something like that will also work. I don't recommend you use alcohol. Try to stick with thinner if you can. So let's go ahead and get this applied to the underbody. I've already demonstrated this technique before, but it's just a matter of going in with a relatively heavy wash of this oil mixed with the thinner. You just apply it in. I'll usually go pretty heavy on these bays like this, and I'll just build it up. And I'll hit it at different angles, like this. I'm doing this a lot faster, by the way, than I normally would. Normally I'd take my time with this, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm moving kind of quick. I'm just going to go in and clean those edges up, and then keep dragging that paint over. Once I get to the center portion, I'll just start from the top and tuck some of that paint underneath that bay. And I'm going to kind of work it towards me like this. And I'm working out all those little paint streaks. I'm not trying to get any on the car body. I just want to keep it just down below for now because we got to do other things to the car body. And then just streak it like this. And that basically completes one of the sections of the base. Notice too, I've done the sill here and then the area around the couplers, which is always the most important. You want to make sure all that grime is very properly tucked in there. So just repeat this process for all the bays, basically. On the top, I'm going to use the large brush, and I'm going to start working some oil in the area around these hatches. I'm going to spread it down first like this and get it built up. The benefit of not having those hatches on there, obviously, is we can work around this area pretty freely. We don't have to get our brush bristles or anything cut on those hatches because there's a lot of small parts on them that the bristles can get caught on. So I'm going to fan this up and over that seam on the trough like this. And I'm just going gently, and I want to preserve all those fine streaks because it's pretty realistic. And if they look kind of chunky at first, don't worry. There's a lot of thinner on this brush, and as we go down, a lot of these will kind of flatten their way out as they go. But this is just a rusting effect here. There's a lot of rust on this roof again, and I'll probably have to do several coats of this to build it up, and I'll also probably do some dry brushing effects here and there. We'll get to that here in a shortly though, but this is just the slow build-up effect again, just slowly getting that color. And I might just vary some of this here sometimes too. Some areas I'll do a little bit heavier build-up, others I'll kind of back off a little bit, just depending on where most of the rust is on that prototype car again. So I've extended a lot of that wash over the sides now, and it's a pretty light wash. What I'm doing now in preparation to do some heavier effects on the walkways is I'm adding the chipping. The walkways on the prototype I'm using are pretty well chipped up. There's actually a lot of chipping on the roof, and there's a lot of heavy rust, so we're going to be working extensively on the roof for a little bit to get all that tied up. But I'm working on the roof walks now, and I'm only adding this chipping to certain parts And then other roof walks I'll just go a little bit lighter on, but basically I'm just using a fine tip and a little bit of burnt umber acrylic, and you just basically can go along and try to just match up the patterns that you see on the prototype. And in this case, the ones on the corner seem to be a little bit heavier on this end, and then the other ones like on this end are a little bit lighter. So there's a lot of variation in this. So it's just going through and just matching up these little spots as best you can. They're obviously not going to be perfect, but at least if you can have some kind of representation for what should be there, that's what counts in the end. So I'm just going to add all these, and I'm also going to work some of that over to the area around the roof walks too, because there, like I said, there is a lot of spots. What I'm working at this point is these heavy patches of rust around the roof walks. We've already done the roof walks for the most part. We're going to let those kind of set up a little bit, and we need to start working that rust out towards the end of the roof, and then it'll start working down the sides just a little bit. So I'm going to start working on that now. And eventually when we get to the sides, we'll use acrylic washes to build up the grime layer, and then we'll use some rust oils and stuff like that. Building up around the roof walk can be a little bit tricky because you have to get the paint underneath the actual roof walk, and on these Intermountain cars you can't just remove them unless you got one of those kits and you can build it up, then that's a great advantage with the kits, but with the assembled models you can't. So the best way to get the rust underneath these roof walks is to take a liner brush and then just take the straight oil paint directly underneath it, and try not to work it too much. But you want to make sure all that's covered under there, because you will get shadowing if you don't get that covered is the problem. So you need to make sure that you're doing this, okay? Because like I said, you will see that through the roof walk if there's unpainted bare areas. This is a common mistake I used to make on my own cars, and it drove me crazy because I'd see that. After a while I started noticing it, and ever since then, every time I do one of these covered hoppers, I always make sure to get that rust, the grime wash, whatever it is, underneath these roof walks basically. So stretch the paint out, work around the interior first, and then you can worry about this portion here, the exposed area. That's the easy part. But basically I'm going to be replicating this rust with dry brushing techniques. You can see I've already done one side where I've basically taken a smaller brush like this that's kind of frayed out, and I've basically scrubbed the paint like this, very carefully working it out like this, and then fanning it back out, making sure not to take any rush, taking out or working at it too much, basically is what I'm trying to say. After I've done this, and after I've given this a couple days to dry, I'll come back with raw sienna, and I'll be able to go down the sides with the raw sienna and work on the roof, because there's a lot of that fresher rust again on these areas too, not just the dark rust. So we'll come back to that, but I'll come back once I get the entire roof done, because basically this whole part here is pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty straightforward. As we let the oils on the roof dry, I'm going to start working these panels a little bit with an acrylic wash, and I'm using a flat brush to do this, and basically what I'm trying to create is the wavy panel effect. And if I zoom in real fast, you guys will see what this is. Basically these panels get this wavy looking wash, and the best way to replicate this is to take a brush loaded with water and basically create these little ripples in the side. Notice how I'm dragging the brush over these panels, and as I do it, I'm creating this wavy looking effect that's very random, and it's basically these little pools of paint that gather in the area where I will basically effectively stomp the brush into the side as I'm going. If I zoom in ultra close, you guys will see this. Let me adjust this a little bit. Watch that brush technique. Notice I'm keeping it directly flat in the panel. It does not take that much paint to do it. Notice that waving. That's what I want you to pay attention to. Notice the waving and how it's depositing that paint. The waves, that's what we want. Blotch the paint out and get it random. If you don't like the way it comes out on some of these panels, just go back, try it again. Don't work it too much though. You want to leave some of that randomness there. Notice that very blotchy, wavy look. That's what we want to create on these, and this is a technique you can use on any covered hopper, and it just makes it look fantastic and much more prototypical. But basically repeat this process for all of these panels all the way to the opposite end of the car. Not so much on the ends, only the side panels. After those washes have dried, I'm going to come back and start laying in some rust spots with straight burnt umber acrylic paint. And I'm just adding some little discoloration spots based on where they are on the prototype. Add some little scratches to the ribs, so forth, so on, you know, that kind of thing. I do this on all my cars. I like to add that little bit of texture and variation. I don't like to just have flat sides with just basic weathering. I like to incorporate all these little elements on these old rust bucket cars because they always have these little pits, and a lot of times in photos you don't even see these either. You got to get up close to one of these cars, which I have before, and you always see these little pits, these little scratches, these little scrapes, and they're what can add a little bit more flavor and character to a car. But you just randomly add them, but don't go overboard. These are just minor little effect spots. Unless you're modeling a true rust bucket where it's just nothing but rust spots, then you can do that. But for a car like this, keep it simple. Notice again the concentrations of rust are only around those sills, and they come down around that channel area, not so much on the center part of the car where the lettering is. So I'm going to try to replicate that now with the oil, and it's going to be a two-layer process where I use burnt sienna and then the burnt umber as the base. So I'm using really well diluted burnt umber first with my thin brush, and I'm going to take it from the top like this, and I'm going to work it down like this. Doesn't have to be perfect, just work it down pretty evenly. Now the next panel will be a little bit lighter, so I'll just go about like this, and if I need to I'll build up the little streaks that I'm going to do later on, because I'm going to do some fine rust streaks down these sides. Sorry about that, let me get this in better focus. So you take the liner brush, start from the top, work it down, and it's nice because this particular liner brush is thin enough that it fits the profile of these ribs pretty nicely. So there's very little effort here trying to keep that straight. Just keep it centered and keep your strokes pretty vertical like that, and then repeat this process both sides on both ends of this little channel section. The finer rust streaks will be easier to build up. I'll use a combination of fine tip brushing, and then I'll use some very specific streaking effects with a little bit of full strength oil. What you do is you load your bristles up with a little bit of straight oil paint. It's non-diluted, and you build it up to where you want some of these little fine streaks to be, and it can be kind of random, but on my prototype there are some very distinct little streaks. So I'm going to add a couple of these and just some little spots just to enhance this really, and then I'll come back, like I said, with some finer rust streaks with the fine tip brush. Now the key here is after you've done that, you load a clean brush, not a dirty brush, clean brush with oil. You don't want to cross-contaminate or darken this anymore. You only want to really get the streaks from the oils. If you have a brush that has oil in it already, it's just going to mix together and it's going to create just another layer of dark grime. I want distinct rust lines here. So it's very key that you make sure you clean this brush, if you've used it before, out with the oil thinner, clean it off, and then prepped it so that it's just full of thinner. Not too much thinner either. It can't be soaking wet. It's got to be a kind of a happy medium here. So watch this technique here. Get your brush loaded with these little bits of thinner. Let me adjust this so you guys can see it a little bit better. Watch carefully now. Start in one corner. Work it down. Now it might be a little bit hard to see, but you're going to see these little streaks start to form. Watch this. Don't work this too much either. Gently blend it, okay? Gently blend it. This is basically the technique you can use to create rust spots or things like that too. This is a great way to do that because it basically fans everything out. Notice now that we got those little fine streaks. Let me clean this brush off just a little bit, and there we go. So now what I'm going to do is enhance this area with the fine tip brush effects. And so what I'm going to do is go in here. Let me load my paint up with a little bit of a thinner. And this is another great technique because you can get the defined little streaks you want, because there's a lot of them built up in this little corner down this sill. And so I'm just going to use my fine tip brush to just come in here, and these will blend out a little bit since the side's still pretty wet with thinner. And I'm just going down and blending that, and as I get more out away from that little sill, I'll just sort of just do some soft little streaks just to give you some representation of the rust kind of fanning out, panning away. And again, I'll just sort of build it up around that little edge there. And I'll just add some others just here and there, again for some color detail. And these will blend pretty well once they all dry up. They won't be so defined, but you'll still be able to see them. You'll still be able to get the hints of what's there after this dries. So that's a great little technique to get some rust spots and rust streaks with this. Alright, so it's been a few hours. This oil's pretty well dry enough to go ahead and put on another layer. And I'm going to switch to the raw sienna here. This is going to be the fresher rust. And I'm going to use again my thin brush to work it down the roof and the sides. I'll be doing a pretty heavy wash of this over the grime, but only in certain spots because I don't want it to be completely all over the place. I'm just going to take this wash and just put it in only some certain spots where I want it. Mainly around these heavier patches like this, just to enhance, add that extra layer of rust, differ the tones a little bit, really. And the key here is you don't work it too much. You don't want to scrub it in. You don't want to, you know, rough it up and then risk damaging the underlying layer. You're just trying to just add some very small highlights of color difference, just in certain areas, so it's not too complicated. Also, while we're at it, we'll hit up certain areas on this roof walk around those heavier patches of rust where you can see I laid in a lot of those dots. I'll lay some of this in. Again, just color variety. Just gently work it in and blend it together so it's not too complicated. So you can see already you get some fine little areas of color difference, which is pretty sweet, and that's exactly what we want. If we zoom in, I'll just again demonstrate just a couple areas on these roof spots of rust here. Just brush it in real softly. Don't need to go too extreme. Just have it in certain little areas and blend it. There's a little bit thinner in this brush, so everything does blend pretty nicely here. I'm working down the side here. Just in those little areas, like that. Let me stabilize that a little bit. There we go. This next step again involves the raw sienna, and it's going to be concentrating it on this panel here and a little bit on these two here around that channel. I don't want to go too crazy with it. It's just going to be a light wash. And wait till you guys see what this does. This color transition is really great. The two colors really complement each other. So if I actually let me get a different angle so you guys can see a little bit better here. If we zoom in on this, you guys will see the magic. So I take the brush, position it just right above, and then I'll start streaking that color down like this, right in that corner. Through that color transition. Isn't that great? We got a much more vibrant, darker rust tone built up. You can see the two colors contrasting, which looks really good, and it all stands out really well. So now what I'm going to do is let all this dry. I'll repeat it on the other side and some other little spots here and there. I'm going to let all the oils dry, and then we can come back and start wrapping up this car. Okay guys, here's the car now. Everything's pretty well tied up. I'm pretty happy with the effects. I did make a minor goof up, and that's that on the prototype. This wasn't as heavy a rust patch job, and unfortunately I kind of overweathered it. And I talk about this all the time. It's what happens when you get excited. You start overweathering stuff. You got to pay attention to your photos. You take your eyes off them for 1 minute and then you screw something up, and in this case I overweathered it. What do you do? On the other side, I did the exact same thing. I just completely got more focused on making this video, stopped paying attention to the photos, just was getting this car done, and I effed up both these sides, because what should be is only this side should have that rust patch according to the photos, and then this side is very light, but I screwed it up. It still looks good. I mean, it still looks fine, but you know, I kind of stopped paying attention to the photos for a second to focus on the video and of course how I was working on the car, and that just happens. It comes down to practice and just paying attention to what you're doing. So, you know, minor slip up there in quality, but that's okay. You know, it still looks good, and we're still really happy with the car. What we need to focus on now here, with the car sides mostly being done, I'm going to go ahead and dull coat all of this and steel this up. Also notice too, the AEX decals are now on. They're patched over it, and then I just took in basically a little bit of that burnt umber and then just brushed it over those patches a little bit to make them look a little bit like they're starting to rust, like they're not so brand new. And it's also the same on the ends. I also added the kick-up spray on the ends, and on the underbays to kind of wrap that up. So all this has been dull coated and sealed in place now, and it's finished up. The last thing I'm going to do is work on the trucks, get those reinstalled. You can see I've already done my painting, and that's just done with the flat black and earth brown acrylic mixed together to make the tone for the truck side frames, and then burnt umber for the wheels. On the sides of the frames, you can see I painted the little stencils for where the numbers will be. So I'm going to go ahead and reinstall these. These are pretty much ready to go. So the last step will be applying the powders, and I'll talk about that real quick. The last weathering step on this car will be to do all of the fine rust effects and powder work. I'm going to be using the AIM Products powders and the Monroe Models powders. I showed these in the previous video. I just used these basic 4 combinations of rust. I can sometimes bring in other shades to enhance stuff if I need to, but for the most part we're going to be keeping it simple. Most of this powder is going to be on the wheels, the couplers, and things like that, on the underbody where I need it, like say for the splash up area on the bays. Things like that, so I'm only going to be using that there. And again, I'm using a variety of small brushes and such to apply these powders to the trucks and the car body itself. After I get these powders applied, that'll pretty much wrap up this project. Alright, so the powders are completed, everything's in place and put back together. The car's sealed up nicely. By the way, someone asked me recently about this. I'd never dull coat over my powder work. I always dull coat the car before I do any kind of powder or shock application, because that will usually get diffused quite a bit by spraying any kind of gloss coat or dull coat over a model. So I never seal in my powder work after I've done it, and I don't really apply it to the sides too much anymore anyway, so really the only place it's going to be is on the underbody, the couplers, the trucks, which I never pick up. When I pick up a model, I pick it up from the very base and very carefully, so I almost never, like I said, touch these areas, so there's no real reason for me personally to have to seal these in. So yeah, I don't seal in my chalk work after I do this. I just basically only do the car body, and that's it. So anyway, everything looks pretty good. I'm really happy with it. The trucks came out really nice as always. The side sill, everything looks pretty good with all that rust. I really like the weathered lettering. I think that looks really nice. Again, the rust on the top looks really good. The AEX patches look really nice. Both sides are pretty much the same on this car too, by the way. If I can keep it all in focus. On the end cages, I went really heavy with the rust. I did a lot of heavy oil washes to the end cages where there's a lot of splash up and things from the wheels. And again, lots of rust on the sides, lots of good rust, some pits, some scratches, and things like that. I like the wavy effect with those washes we did. They're kind of hard to see on camera here. I'll take some pictures in a minute of this car so you guys can see it at the end of the video, but there's a lot of good wavy panel effects on the sides of the car. Again, it's all really well highlighted on this model. I think it turned out really well. And then just as a quick view, there's again the under bay with all the rust pitting and scratching. It's a common feature on these cars. And then the top portion of this car came out really good. And notice the varying washes I used on the top to represent some different hatches or replaced hatches. This is all based on prototype photos. This one actually popped off. I gotta reposition that one. But it all looks pretty good, and I'm really happy with it. So that is the second car in my fleet so far that I've gotten done. And again, hopefully you guys like this video, and you guys can stay tuned for the next car I'll be doing here pretty soon. So I'll see you in the next video, guys. Take it easy.